So when I draw, I tend to think of scales. When I do scales, I mean as in if you scale things from 1 to 10 in light to dark, how light is something. I try to make things easier by printing things in black and white if I'm drawing in pencil, just because you see that grayscale version of everything before you even go into doing the drawing itself. The first thing that I tend to look at is where does the tones actually come in on that scale. So if you imagine that scale going from 1 to 10, I'll just draw something very quickly here as a scale. So if you take 1 being the lightest thing, normally when it comes to eyes, I like to draw eyes because it's a very good reference point, because there's a lot of complexity in an eye, but you also get a very good understanding of not just shape, but also the shades, detail, and also there's a little bit behind it as well, because you look at the anatomy of an eye as well. So it kind of, there's a lot of things that play into it, and for some reason a lot of people do get a lot of fascination in eyes. I myself am one of them. I think they're incredibly interested on a portrait, whether that be an animal or a human. I think that cliche thing of it being a window to a soul is definitely on the mark there. Going back to these scales, I tend to think of number 1 being the lightest thing on an eye is normally the reflection of light. So if you look here, you can see the reflection of the light here is from the window. This is obviously my own eye here that I've taken a picture of just earlier. This light is the window that's just behind us. That being the lightest scale, contrasting to that, very next to it, the actual centre of my eye there is the darkest element in that whole picture as well. So we get, immediately we have this stark contrast between a 1 and a 10. And everything else around it, you can see, is on that scale. Now, obviously it's open to interpretation, of course it is. But this is why a lot of the time, pencils don't come in just one sort of shade or hardness, level of hardness. So H being, it's a very hard pencil, lead is just graphite, means it leaves quite a light tone because it's hard, which enables you to draw something that would be actually quite a hard line, so you can draw much more accurately, but then in the same breath it also doesn't leave a very dark mark. Going down that scale then, if you then use a HB, which is a common pencil hardness, just for its flexibility in both going into a dark element and then also a light element with accuracy. A HB pencil kind of works much better. If I go harder here, you can see I'm pressuring just the same as I did in that first one. So that one being a H, that's a HB. If I go down the scale again and I find a 3B, I'll apply the same hardness again, going light and then harder. And you can see as I go down that scale, I will have much more flexibility with shades as I go further down the scale. Obviously ending up here. An 8B, it goes up to 9B I think. An 8B on a contrast to that scale, obviously. There's many in between that, but that's the light. And then pressing really hard for a dark. You can really get a dark shade out of that. So yeah, that's the contrasting scales. So obviously 10, I would use my darkest pencil to get the scale of that 10. So that we know that that 10 is achievable with that pencil. Many of these pencils can be sort of cross-referenced on that scale as well. So if I was to use an 8B, as you can see here, if I draw lightly, I can probably get down to about a scale of a 7 here. But just because you have the range of pencils, feel free to use all of them really. When you start out drawing, my favourite ones that I tend to use at the beginning stages would probably be a H, just to draw the outlines of things. Then I would probably go to a 2B. It's a good midway point where you can still add darks into the tones. And then I will go full on, once I'm happy with the positioning of everything, I'll go then into a darker tone. of, like, say, a 6B or an 8B, as you can see. But just being on that scale, obviously, I mean, I can show you for a reference, I'm using a 5B here. And I could probably achieve quite a lot of this scale just using this pencil if I wanted to. Just through the technique of knowing how each of them work. So you can see here, I can probably scale quite a lot of this. But then I can't achieve to this level. So you can work the scale with each pencil, as I was saying, but each pencil will have its limitations to a level. But when you're starting out, obviously you don't need to go too far into this sort of theory of how each one works. And I mean, obviously this is just from my trial and error and what I've learned throughout the years of me doing a lot of pencil work in my time as working as an artist and what I've been used to. But when I look at a lot of drawings, I tend to see where somebody is stuck to one pencil, and you see this spectrum. It's very grey. There's not a lot of darks and lights, and it can make it look very washed out as a whole piece. So just be wary of that when you do your own drawings. Just don't be afraid to go into the darker scales, because those darker scales really punch out the shapes, and it really creates a three-dimensional shape of the object that you're drawing, whatever that is. And like I say, there will always be that scale from 1 to 10. If it's not an eye, if I take something, say, like this masking tape here, if I was to put that here, immediately you can see where there's light bouncing off of the cardboard on the inside here. That would probably be on your 1 scale. And then on your darker scale, maybe not 10, but the darker scale would definitely be this line that is right across here on the bottom of this masking tape, creating that outline. And then in between that you would have the scale between 1 and 10. So going on from that, I'll get started and I'll show you as I go. I'll make some mistakes, everybody does, and that's the whole point of having a eraser. And yeah, I'll take you through it. If you're happy to sit over my shoulder, and I'll explain as I go. So to begin with, I'm going to start with a H. Again, it's nice and it's a hard lead, so I'll be able to draw really lightly. I probably won't get it right in the middle, but I tend to go from left to right because I'm right-handed, so I don't smudge too much. If I start over here and then I start drawing here, it starts, blending things too much. So one last thing I want to say before I start is many people tend to make the same error of drawing like this. It's okay at certain points, but to draw all the time like this, you tend to force yourself into drawing like you write, and it tends to look too forced. When you're drawing, try and draw like this. So you can see where my thumb is, where my fingers are. So it enables you to almost, you can draw much more loosely, and believe it or not, it actually trains your brain to think of what you're doing as a different thing that you're trying to attempt, if that makes sense. So you're not trying to write a letter, or you're not trying to write a note. You are doing a different task, and so you're learning a new skill by holding it differently. Trust me, it makes a world of difference. So I'll start probably with the eyebrow, because it's quite a striking shape that goes straight across the whole thing. So it'd be a good reference point for me to start the eye from. So if I take it from here, I could probably go like straight across like this. Again, I'll just draw lightly. I tend to do hairy lines. What I mean by that is with a hairy line, you're not definitely drawing a line. If you draw it over a few times and you're not happy with some of these lines that you're drawing, you can always rub them out, because you've only sketched it on very lightly.